Esteemed rabbis, ladies and gentlemen, you were told that I was born in Warsaw, which is technically true, but actually we lived in Węgro, which is, as you were told, a town 70 kilometers east of Warsaw and 20 kilometers from Treblinka, which made it very convenient for the Nazis. When they had to take, they had to. When they took our people to Treblinka, they didn't need trains, they didn't need trucks. It was enough to have a horse-drawn wagon with a couple of guards in the back, and that was it. In any case, a bit of background. Węgro is a town of 16,000 people, 6,000 Jews, and 10,000 Poles. It had a long Polish history going back to the 16th century. We had a very large synagogue, which was destroyed by the Nazis. First they used it as a stable, then they destroyed it. My paternal grandfather was an Alexander Hasid. My father, one of five, he was the oldest, was not a Hasid, but he had respect and he knew. My father was a businessman, a reasonably successful small businessman. He had had a dry goods store in Warsaw. He ran a summer resort near Warsaw, a place called Orlew, and he also had a small lumber yard in Węgro. In any case, when things started getting tough, he moved back to Węgro, and he just had the lumber yard. There was nothing else left. He had the good sense to take all his Polish paper money and turn it into American gold pieces. Now, about 2 weeks after that, Polish paper became just that, Polish paper. And it was that gold which really helped to save us. My father was the only one of his siblings who was married. His father had passed away, so it was his mother and siblings ran the store. My father and my sister, who is 5.5 years my senior, and I lived separately in Węgro. Now, one story worth telling, that there are many, but I can't go into everything, or even into very many of them, but my father went to Warsaw sometime in 1940, the middle of 1940, and he went there because he thought he may have some stock or to do some business there. I don't know exactly why, but he brought food to the Admor, Yitzchak Menachem Danziger, who was the Admor of the Alexander Hasidim, and he brought him food, and the rabbi said to him, Yitzchak, you and your family will survive. And so it was. The Admor did not. He was murdered by the Nazis. Anyway, back to Węgro. When the Germans invaded Poland, it took them only a few days to get to Węgro. There was really no resistance between Warsaw and Węgro. At first, the Jews ran away, but then there was no place to go to, so they came back. Yom Kippur, 1939, the Nazis gathered up the Jewish community in the town square, and they got the chief rabbi, Rabbi Morgenstern. He was a sign of many generations of rabbis. They told him to sweep the streets of the horse manure and to dance, and then to gather up all the horse manure in his shtreimel and to put it on his head, while the Jewish community stood around and cried. He did that, then they stabbed him. It was not a stab meant to kill, but he had a blood disease and he died of his wounds. The real killing had not started yet. There were all humiliations, large and small, but life went on somehow. And my father, being a very resourceful man, managed to keep food on our table. Things kept getting worse. They moved us out of our house and into a smaller apartment, which was actually on one of the main roads and at the end of town. And my mother said to my father, listen, we need a place to hide. If things get really bad, we have no place to go. But where do you go? We're surrounded by poles. We're in a small house there. And my father just couldn't come up with anything. Then one night he had a dream, and he got up and he says, I know what to do. In the back, we had some disused sheds. And no, just people stored junk in them and whatnot. No one went near them with rusty locks on them. Anyway, he went there in the middle of the night, and he dug a hole about the size of a, let's say, a dining room table, perhaps 6 feet deep. And this was going to be our bunker. Now, that's very nice, except it's not very nice, but it was possible, except what do you do now? You have to build some sort of a roof, and to do that, you have to bang, you have to saw. Now, the work, you can imagine, was horrible, because he went out there at night, and he had to drag buckets of dirt out and dump them in a field, which was nearby, which was lucky for us. But he could only work late at night, and he slept during the day. Anyway, he managed to dig the hole, but what do you do now? He prepared the materials, but he couldn't bang, he couldn't saw. As luck or Elohim, I don't know, whatever you like, had it, there was a fire in town, and it was clanging and a great commotion, everybody ran, and he took this opportunity for building the ceiling and building the supporting posts. Now, for the trapdoor, he built a shallow box, filled it with dirt, oh, it was very shallow, filled it with dirt, and put old tins and chicken manure and whatever, just make it look horrible. When he finished, he called my mother in and said, where is the trapdoor? And she said, I don't know. So he says, okay, it's good. In the meantime, my mother had spent her time baking hard, call it cookies for want of a better word, but like hardtack, things that would keep, and put them into tins and took them down and stored them. She also made jam out of beets. That's what was available, and I found a couple of tins of sardines. It was very meager, and we had 2 buckets down there, one for water and one was a latrine. Anyway, Yom Kippur 1942 was the last Yom Kippur that the Ben Grove community had. One of my uncles in the meantime had married during the war. He was the last Jewish wedding in Ben Grove, but he stayed with the rest of the family on the other side of town in the store. After Yom Kippur, just after Yom Kippur, they were shooting and screaming and Shema Yisrael and just mayhem. My parents picked me up and my sister, and we jumped into our hole there. Well, we were there, and a day later, my maternal grandmother came. Now, my maternal grandmother, my mother was the only child. Her father had died when she was 2 years old. She never knew him. My maternal grandmother had remarried a man 20, 25 years her senior. And they had been moved out of their house into a half a room that was curtained off. I remember visiting there. It stank. It was awful. In any case, apparently the Ukrainians in their black uniforms, we called them the Black Devils because there was absolutely no talking to them. Once in a blue moon, you could find in German that you could talk to. The Ukrainians never. Anyway, they came in there and they told this older man, he said, okay, you're moving, go. And he said, I'm not going anywhere. He took out a pistol and shot him point blank in the head. That was the end of him. My grandmother ran away, and she came to us. There was no room there. She sat, either my father or she sat in the shed, and were just impossible. And then she said, you know what, I think I have a place to go. I have a good friend who will help me. And she went. Now, We heard later that she was carted off to Treblinka, and we always thought that she really didn't have any place to go, that she just sacrificed herself for us. Now, the air supply was a drain pipe which ran out into a field. That was our light and that was our air. That's all there was. At night, my father went out and he dumped, in the middle of the night, he'd dump the latrine bucket and he'd fill the water bucket. We stayed there in this living grave for 7 weeks. Now, we ran out of food. Oh, there was a nice incident just before that, but a few days after we moved in, apparently one of the Poles saw some movement there, and he called the Ukrainians, and they came into the shed, and they stood on our trapdoor, and they banged their rifles all around and around, looking for hollow places. Had they turned around and banged here, that would have been the end of us. You see that your life hangs by a hair. You never know. Anyway, they didn't find it. So we stayed there, impossible as it was. As I said, it was a living grave, nothing much better than that. And we ran out of food. Even with our meager rations, it only lasts so long. Says, well, what should we do? I was too small to go. My parents were known in town. So they sent my sister. She was 10 years old at the time. She was emaciated and white, and she walked out. And as she was walking, a Polish girl came up to her and said, I know you're Jewish. Just give me your money or I'll tell the Germans. Now, she was smart enough to give her half her money. Now, once she was out, my father said, if you're out there, go and check on our family, see if they're there. Go into the store and check on friends called Elblings, check on them in another place. Anyway, she went and she checked and she called out their names. There was no answer. She went down into a cellar there where the other family was supposed to be hiding. There was nothing there. She thought she saw bodies there. She wasn't sure. But she did manage to buy bread, and she brought back a loaf of bread. Now, you make it last as long as possible, but it doesn't last forever. Now, let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, the difference between starvation and being hungry is, as I said before, the difference between the sniffles and double pneumonia is just not the same thing. You don't know if you're going to get any food. You fantasize about food. There isn't any food. I never cried. I never cried. I never asked for anything. I never complained. I guess children cry when they think they're going to get something. You know, you cry loud enough, you drive your parents crazy enough, you'll get a toy or get an extra piece of chocolate, whatever it is. There's nothing. And there's nothing to cry for. I never cried. We also never spoke. We only whispered like this because voices carry, and we learned to whisper. And we whispered for years to the point where after the war I didn't have a voice. I could only whisper. Anyway, this went on for a while, and I developed a cough. I can control crying, I can control talking, can't control coughing. What do? One of the Poles hears me cough, we're dead. My father opened the trap door, and there was an egg there. There were chickens in the area, with no chickens right there, but there was an egg there. We took it, and he added some sugar. There was a little bit of sugar left. He mixed it up, and I drank it. We call those things a goggle mogul. I don't know if anybody knows what that is. It doesn't matter. But the concoction helped. I stopped coughing. Anyway, lasted a while. We ran out of food. Worked once. Why not again? Rini, go get food. She went to the bakery, and the baker said, I'm sorry, we don't sell bread to Jews. So she came back, and I'm pretty sure someone must have seen a movement or someone move or something. And this is after 7 weeks. One of our wonderful Polish neighbors came and lifted up the trap door and saw us there and started screaming. And my father said, please, just give us an hour, we'll be out of here. And she was in a panic, didn't know what to do. Now, my father had money with him, gold pieces, which he made a donut out of them. And he put them on my wrists and on my legs. He had no money on him whatsoever. Everything we had was on me. and he put me on his back in a sheet, the way you might see Ethiopians carrying their babies sometimes. And we just ran. And it was still light outside. We didn't know what to do, but we found shelter in a root cellar. And it was a root cellar that had some kind of, I forget what it was called, but it smelled pretty bad. And we stayed there till it was dark. And then we got up and went into the forest. This is November 1942. We were walking through the forest, and a gang of Polish robbers comes upon us. They want our money. Well, search me, haven't got any money. They saw the package, which was me, on my father's back, and they saw it was a baby, so they left me alone. They didn't want a baby, they wanted goods. But they took my father's boots. So here was my father in November in Poland with no boots in the middle of a forest. And we walked for a while kind of aimlessly, and then he sat down, probably the only time I ever remember my father just sort of giving up. He said, I just can't walk anymore. His feet turned blue. Now, my father was a very, very Jewish-looking man. My mother was not. She could pass for a Pole. Her Polish was much better than my father's. And she was light-skinned and gray-eyed. And she saw smoke in the distance, so she said, let me try and get some help. She walked over there and she explained the situation to him, to the Pole there, and she said, look, we can pay. Can you help us? Well, for money, he decided he would do it. So we got over there, and this is the first time I remember that I got a glass of milk with honey in it. That was absolute heaven. I never had anything that good in my whole life. I managed to get my father a pair of boots. They were way too big on him because the Polish peasants had feet like this, and my father was a small Jewish man. But there were boots. Anyway, we stayed there for 2 days, and the Pole said, the Germans are coming out. And we said, where? He said, I don't care, just out. So we split up. My father and my sister went in one direction into a woods, and my mother and I went in the other direction, and we sat by a pond. My mother put on a kerchief, a peasant kerchief, and we sat there. I was a very blonde little boy, so I could easily pass for a Pole also. Anyway, we sat there, and I remember telling my mother, why couldn't we be cows? See those cows, they're just wandering around eating grass, nobody's bothering them. And my poor mother started to cry. Anyway, came darkness, we came back. My father and sister were not back, and we thought that was the end. But a while later, they did come back. In any case, the Pole said, I don't want you here anymore, out. He says, where? I don't care, just go. So my father had a name in another town, not town, these are little farming villages, a while away, and he was a big, strong fellow with strong sons, and he thought they would help us because my father had done business with them in the lumber business. He went there, and he knocked on the door, and they saw my father, and they said, go, I don't want you near here, get lost. And my father said, well, at least sell us some bread. He said, no, I don't want anything to do with you, go away. He said, please, just some bread. So they sold us some bread at a very high price, and we went back where to go. So we went back to the original farm. There was no place else to go. And we spoke to him and said, look, we can pay, find us a place. So they were all cousins and first cousins and half-brothers, and a whole bunch of them living there. There was one very poor man by the name of Tofil. He was a farmer, and he directed us toward him. We went there, and for a lot of money, he decided to keep us. He kept us in the back room. He kept us locked up in the back room. And we were there for a while. Now, my father was afraid to pay him. I mean, you have to pay him, but he was afraid that he was a peasant. He was not the smartest or most sophisticated person in the world, as you can imagine. But if he were to take those gold pieces and go into town and start buying things, it would not take a genius to figure out where he got that money from, because these people had nothing. Anyway, we tried to tell him this, and he more or less listened. And we kept in touch with our while we were there, I think this is one of the most momentous decisions my father made. While we were there, we heard that the Germans said, it had a proclamation that said that the killing is over, the Jews have to come back to Vengrove, they will work, it will be a ghetto, they will work, but they will be left alone. Now, the first one, what we call the first action, akcja they called it, many Jews ran away, such as we and others, and now they said, now you come back. However, anyone who's caught outside of Vengrove after 10 days or so will be shot on sight. And most Jews by far went back because they had no place to go. And my father said, no, I'm going to take my chances in the countryside. Meanwhile, his brothers and sister and mother and his brother's wife had hidden in the attic of the house. They built a double wall, so they were hidden between two walls. This was a system we used later on as well. So that if somebody walked into the attic from the side, they couldn't tell anything because this wall looked exactly the same as this one. They were in between. Anyway, they survived and they came down, and they were still in Vengrove, and they got a job with a Jewish dry cleaner called Kreda. Now he thought he was safe because he was the only dry cleaner in Vengrove he was the only dry cleaner in Vengrove, never mind for anything, but he was the only one that knew how to clean German uniforms, German officers' uniforms and others. So he had a special pass that he could work there, and he hired my uncles, and they also got these passes. So they were okay for a while. Now, we kept in touch with them through this Tofil. He used to go into town to do his buying and selling, and he'd deliver a letter to my uncle, who would then give him a letter back each day that we were alive. Anyway, this didn't last all that long. You know, this Kreda was, felt that he almost wasn't Jewish, that he was king of the castle, until one day the Nazis came in with a pole and said, I want you to teach him the business. And my uncles were smart enough to realize this is the end of the line. So he wrote a letter through the Goy to my father. And he said, look, our mother has no place to be. You have to take her. You have to do something with her. Otherwise, it'll be on your head. It's a terrible thing to say, but he was desperate. So my father said, okay, come. So she came. I should mention that just before this, while you could still go to Vengrove, when you said you could come back to Vengrove, my father went back into Vengrove, and he buried some gold there, as well as a Kiddush cup that belonged to my maternal grandfather that I still have today. We retrieved it after the war. Anyway, the mother came with my youngest uncle, and they came at night, and we hid them in the barn. We didn't tell Tofil that they were there. Tofil was not keen on having us, much less having somebody else. Then my other uncle came, and then the married uncle with his wife came. Well, that was pretty well it. So we told Tofil, we spoke to him, and we said, look, we'll build a bunker outside, not on your territory. You supply us with food, and we'll pay you. We're not on your territory, we have nothing to do with you. So we did that for a while, but no, before that, my father's sister, the last one, was running. She was shot by a Ukrainian. She was left for dead, and she got up and she ran the rest of the way she came to us. Luckily, it was a flesh wound, and my father, I remember my father, who was the oldest brother, was nursing her with some warm water that he warmed up under his armpit and a relatively clean rag. She did not get blood poisoning, and she survived. In the meantime, we moved into this bunker, which my uncles and my father built. It was impossible, just couldn't stay there. It was stifling and just not doable. So we spoke to Tofil, and he said, look, I have a half-brother here and a cousin there, and something that each one will take somebody. And we agreed. And there was one rich farmer that I think was a half-brother of his. And he decided that he would take my sister and my mother, and he would take my father, but he wouldn't take me. He would not take a chance on me, because as much as they told him he's a good kid, he won't cry, he won't complain, he wasn't interested, because he knew very well if I acted up, that was the end of him. So my father and I went back to Tofil, and we stayed there for a number of months. Now, we stayed in the back room, and my father dug a trench. My father dug a trench in the kitchen and covered it with one of the boards. And if anyone ever came, we'd lift up the board, jump underneath, and move the stove on top of it. And my father and I spent many hours down there. My father was very good with his hand. I remember he made me little toys. There were two little sticks with a piece of string in between. He made a little man, and you wound it up, and you pulled it, and twirled around. He kept me amused as much as he could. One day we were outside. My father, as I said, had good hands, and he carved a rifle for me out of a piece of wood. Came out very, very well. Tofil, the farmer, had a son a little bit older than I, and he wanted one too. So he started to carve one. It came out all crooked and awful. The kids started to bawl. The farmer got nervous. He threw his rifle into the fire. My father quickly sized up the situation, took the rifle out of my hand, and gave it to the other kid. I never complained. My father knew very well the last thing we wanted was to make Tofil angry. I mean, we used to watch his face to see that, what mood he was in, because our lives depended on him. Anyway, this went on for a while. Finally, they wanted us out, didn't want us anymore. And my mother and one of my uncles went. They heard that there was a place, maybe somebody would take us. So we went there, and he said, look, we'll build a bunker under the ground there. You just supply us with some food, and we'll be there. And he agreed. We paid him a lot of money again. And we all went underground again. We were there for a while, and it started to rain. We were 10 people now. And it started to rain, and the thing started to fill up with water, and the roof started to sag, and we got out of there. And my uncle was the last one out. My youngest uncle, Moshe, was the last one out, and he wore a black berry, which ran with the water and turned his hair green. And we all looked at him, and we all started to laugh. It was Moshe with the green hair. Now you can imagine what we looked like, a bunch of ghouls. We just crawled out of a grave. We're standing there, we're filthy, overgrown, just disgusting. And we're standing there laughing because Moshe has green hair. It was a release, I guess. Anyway, my parents went back to, his name was Bielawski. He said to him, listen, he says, you've got to hide. He says, I'm afraid, I have no place to hide you. So again, my father and uncle said, look, if we find a place that you can't find, will you keep us? He said, yes. So he says, okay, give us materials and go away for a few hours. And they basically did the same thing again, only in the barn this time. They built a double wall, right? And they made one side of it dirty. This was in the attic where hardly anybody went anyway. This was a barn. And the entrance was through a ladder at the bottom, which we drew up. Anyway, we all climbed up there, except my father and his younger brother. And they called Bielawski and said, okay, where are we? He looked around, looked here, looked there, climbed up to the attic. I don't know. He said, called his wife. He says, I don't know. He says, can we stay? He said, yes. Okay. So we showed them where we were, and we were up there. Now again, it was a small area. We were 10 people. Again, 2 buckets, 1 latrine, one water, and that was it. And he brought a loaf of bread a day, if he remembered. If he didn't, he brought nothing. When he was out in the field, again, he brought nothing. And that's the way it was. And we were covered with lice and fleas and bed bugs and every, God knows, every vermin known to man, I think. And that's where we were. That was our life. And you can't be afraid 24 hours a day. Your body doesn't work like that. When we were in imminent danger, of course, the adrenaline works. But when you're not in but nonsense. These 2 5'4" emaciated Jews are going to take on the Nazi army from some of the toughest fighting of the Second World War. I mean, that the chances of the proverbial snowball in hell. But that's what they thought. Anyway, the Russians were coming, and the Germans decided to pull the cannon out. They pulled the cannon out, and just as they left it, one of the officers said, "Aufreißen." Aufreißen means blow it up. Well, that's the end. The Russians came so fast, though, that they didn't have a chance to blow it up. And the Russians came, and the Germans on the run were not the Germans on the attack. You know, a soldier, when he's marching in victory is one thing, when he's running for his life is something else again. They didn't look all that invincible anymore at that stage. Anyway, the Russians came. We waited a couple of days until they past Vengrov, and then we dragged our ways to Vengrov. Nobody could walk, or hardly could. You can imagine what we looked like, filthy, disgusting. I certainly wouldn't have wanted to come near us. I couldn't walk at all. They carried me more or less a bit. Anyway, we made our way into Vengrov, and we went to a Red Army soup kitchen, not a soup kitchen, an army kitchen, and I must say they were very decent. They fed us. This was not the American Army. They ate cabbage and potatoes. That's what they ate, but they shared what they had. And we found a place, a small place to be. Meanwhile, I had developed a cyst on my back. And remember, the war was not over yet. It was over for us. We were freed earlier because we were in eastern Poland. The battle for Warsaw was still on, but we were freed. So my mother took me to a Polish hospital, and they drained the cyst. By the time I came home, it had filled up again. So we went back to the hospital, and the doctor said, "No, he's too weak. He won't be able to take it." My father then took me to a Red Army hospital, and he asked for a Jewish doctor. You can always find a Jewish doctor everywhere. So he asked for a Jewish doctor, and he came, although they're not allowed to treat civilians. He was a Jewish doctor, and he said, "Look, I'll do the operation on him. It's the only chance he's got." So they put me on the table. They used some kind of alcohol or something. There were nothing else there. He cut it open without any kind of anesthesia at all. And he bandaged me up and sent me home. I spent about 3 months in bed, just between life and death. But obviously I'm here, so I'm here. And we survived that. Afterwards, when the war was over, I'm not going to go into all the stories in between, there's too many of them. When the war was over, we went to Częstochowa. We spent a short while there. Then we moved to a town called Bytom. Now in Bytom, I went to a Catholic school. I had no schooling, although, as I said, they taught me to read, write, and arithmetic, and my competition there was not all that great. So I was in a Catholic school, but I was a Catholic for all intents and purposes, and I had to go to church on Sundays, because that was the rule. They didn't know I was Jewish. The name Bielawski is not a Jewish name, it's a Polish name. So I went to church. Now in church, you're supposed to dip your hand in the holy water and cross yourself. Now, I never touched the holy water. That was my own protest to the whole thing. I had to cross myself because everybody saw it, but I never touched the holy water. And those little Polish kids were anti-Semites. They'd never seen a Jew in their lives. And they said, "I would kill a Jew if I saw one because they killed Jesus because this, because that." One day, a Jewish kid came to our school, and I saw immediately he was Jewish. He was dark with curly hair. And I went up to him quietly and said, "Are you Jewish?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "If you want to stay alive here, keep your mouth shut. Just keep your mouth shut." Well, he didn't. They beat him up. He never came back again. Anyway, we stayed there for a while. My grandmother, meanwhile, lived in Lodz. She was very sick, and my mother and I took a train to Lodz. On the way to Lodz, some Poles stopped the train. They pulled 7 Jews off the train and shot them. This is 1946. This is not 1942 or 43. This is 1946. So I didn't realize until recently what wonderful friends the Poles were to us. I mean, the Polish government just told us how great they are, right? Anyway, my mother just went like this. I sat quietly. My mother, as I said, didn't look Jewish. I didn't look Jewish, and we kept going. After that, my father went to Vienna ahead of us to make room for us. And then we followed, a story there in between I won't go into. We followed from there. We moved to Canada. My mother had a half-brother from her father from the first marriage. My grandmother was a second marriage. Anyway, we were sponsored by him, went to Canada, and in 1968 we moved to Israel. And I'm not an emotional man, but when my grandson, Nadav, was sworn into the paratroops in Jerusalem, in front of the Kotel, that really touched me, that I lived long enough to see this. Anyway, that's basically the story. Thank you.